I'm State Representative Janine Nodder, and we have a full house here on the set of Chatting with Janine this week. Sitting right next to me is the Executive Chairman for the Center of Security Policy. He's the former Assistant Secretary of Defense for President Ronald Reagan. Seated next to him is Dr. Sean Lin, who is a survivor of the Tiananmen Square massacre. And then next to him is Jay Lucas, whose biography is so long it would take half the show for me to tell you who he is, but he is a returning guest. And then later on we're going to hear from Joe Bosco, who's the former China Desk Officer for the Department of Defense. So welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Janine.
Thank you. Welcome to Merrimack.
Very, very nice to be here. Thanks for having us.
So Jay, you've been on the show before, but I think we were talking about the Children for Fallen Patriots. And just this morning, you introduced me to these two gentlemen and also our audience member, Joe Bosco, who will be joining us halfway through the show.
Well, yeah, thanks for having us. Yeah, we're here to we'd love to talk to you about a really important topic, and that is China. And the massive threat China poses to our country overall, but really ultimately to our freedom. And on so many dimensions, Janine, economically, militarily, I think in terms of artificial intelligence, espionage, right on down the list, even our supply chain. And several months ago, I was fortunate to be talking with Frank Gaffney, whose background includes being with the Center for Security Policy. He was actually the founder of that organization.
I didn't say your name at the beginning. I'm
You
sorry.
didn't, but I was hoping it was in the
Frank
car
is a
run.
great guy. But Frank and I were talking, and he is leading an effort that I feel very strongly about on this whole China issue. And it's called Committee on the Present Danger, China. And the objective of the organization is to develop information about what China is doing, then be able to disseminate that information, and to a large extent, identify ways that we can thwart this massive effort that they have toward a stated goal of world domination that really can impact us significantly. So I'm very pleased to be joined today by Frank, who's come up from DC, along with Sean Lin, and Joe, who'll be joining us later, to just talk about this and the background, not only on the organization, but to share with our viewers the enormity of the threat. And it's really a major undertaking to try to thwart this.
Well, since we have two segments, I want to hear from Dr. Sean Lin first, because at the lunch today you were telling us about organ harvesting, and it was just so alarming for us to hear. It reminds me of looking at our history. People would hear about the Holocaust and nobody wanted to believe it. Who could believe such a thing happening? Or the starvation of the people of the Ukraine. And here today, present day, we have people being murdered for their organs. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, you got it right. Actually, it's very similar to the Holocaust in the 1940s when it happened. When the public didn't want to believe this such a horrible crime happening right in Germany, and this time when this organ harvesting being exposed, even people in China and US, when they heard about the news, they had hard to believe it. Because it's so heinous crime that the government has been doing, and it's not even individual or small hospitals doing it, not individual industry doing it. It's actually government-sanctioned operation to use this organ transplant medical practice, make it as a tool to kill people and then take their organ and make profit from it. So it's a very systematic operation by the Chinese government.
And you're from Maryland. You came up from Maryland.
Yes.
And you have a radio show.
Yeah, run a local radio station, WQER, in Rockville, Maryland.
I had it written down on another piece of paper.
It's the only Mandarin broadcasting radio station in the whole DC area.
Oh, Mandarin Chinese.
Yes,
oh,
yes,
interesting.
yes.
And I know you gave me some pamphlets about the medical genocide and the wait. And I just highlighted this. In China, organ transplants are conducted on demand. They are scheduled in advance, have a short wait time, and they use organs taken from living sources.
Yeah, the waiting time is so short. In the United States, for kidney transplant, usually people wait 2 to 3 years. Or in China, they advertise on the website, say, come here, we promise you 2 to 3 weeks you will get a kidney transplant. And you can even schedule a date for the transplant. And for liver, usually in the United States, you wait for 10 years. and then they promise in China that you can do it in 1 month or 2 months, and you can also schedule a date, so you know someone who will die on that day for you to give you the kidney.
Yeah.
It's terrible.
With the one-child policy in China, is that still the case? You're allowed one child? Because
Now, recently they reverted to allow 2, because the society, because the structures become so unbalanced, right? So
right,
basically,
a whole generation with no brothers or sisters or
Yes.
cousins or aunts and uncles.
yeah.
There's
Or
certainly no
women.
sisters.
Or women. What's the ratio? You told me that
So
before the show.
in China, at least 20 million more male adults than the females, because so many, especially in the countryside, people only want the male kids, so they kill a lot of the females. And you can see in the United States, many of the family adopt the Chinese children, primarily all girls.
Yes,
So-
that's true. Oh, then where can my viewers go to find out more about this heinous genocide?
Yeah, so there are several organizations actually investigate this organ harvesting. So one of them is actually the China Tribunal, and they actually formally announced their final judgment last June 2019. So they confirmed that this is actually an ongoing practice in China in a large scale, and Falun Gong practitioners and Uyghur are the primary victim group. They're being systematically organ harvested.
Organharvest.org.
Yeah, organharvest.org.
Look that up. ChinaOrganHarvest.org. So I can hold this up if you can zoom in. Thank you,
Thank you very
and
much.
thank you for joining us on this show.
Thank you.
And we're back, and joining us on the stage is Joseph Bosco, who is the former China Desk Officer for the Department of Defense. Did I get your name right?
You sure
I
did.
did. Frank Gaffney, PresentDangerChina.org is your website, and of course Jay Lucas of everything. You do a lot
Well,
of
and
things.
it's great to be here, Janine.
Great to have you here.
Thanks.
So we wanted to hear from Joe to give us an overview of how we got to where we are today with this danger from China.
Well, the interesting thing is that we're in the presidential year, and in the election of 1960, Kennedy and Nixon debated, and the one thing they agreed upon was that Red China was a serious threat to the United States.
And remains so to this day.
That's the problem, is that for 40 years, that goes back 60 years, but when Nixon ran again and was elected in 1968, he had a plan to change the dynamic that had been pressuring U.S.-China relations. We had been at war with China in North Korea. When North Korea invaded South Korea, China was party to that and was condemned by the United Nations as an aggressor. Nixon decided that we had to change the dynamic, that we could not continue to have China as an outsider in what he called the family of nations. We had to bring them in, engage with them, moderate their policies so they would not threaten their neighbors and threaten others and persecute their own people. So he launched his opening to China. His partner in that venture was Henry Kissinger, who had a different perspective. He frankly had no professional experience with China at all. His only concern was to play the so-called China card against the Soviet Union and to get China to agree for us to withdraw peacefully from Vietnam, So he persuaded Nixon to make a number of concessions to China to facilitate the opening, then the meeting between Nixon and Mao. And he took the U.S. 7th Fleet out of the Taiwan Strait, withdrew U.S. forces from Taiwan, and pledged that in Nixon's expected second term, we would recognize China instead of Taiwan. So all these concessions were made from the very start. And that set a pattern that persisted for the next 40 years. Every administration after Nixon, in effect, said, well, if Nixon did it, it must be the right thing because he was considered a real hawk on China, and he had decided now that engagement was the best policy. So we'll follow that pattern. And Kissinger, God bless him, he's been there for all these years, he persuaded each subsequent administration to follow that same policy. At the same time, he was advising both Chinese leaders and American leaders on how our relations should proceed. So on one issue after another, human rights, trade, Taiwan, South China Sea, we continue to make concessions to China so that they will think well of us and act more moderately and behave responsibly in the international community. But it hasn't worked. We now have discovered, others have known about it for many years, that it wasn't working. And now we're facing what Frank and others have called the present danger from China.
And that's a good segue.
It is. It really brings you very sharply into focus, I think, on this question of if we continue doing the same things we've been doing for the past 40 or 60 years, for that matter, will we get a different result? And it calls to mind, that famous Einstein quote about that being the definition of insanity, assuming that if you just keep doing the same thing, you'll get a different outcome. In this case, what would just be insane is also mortally perilous. Because what the Chinese government has done, I think going back to 1991 at least, when they saw the Soviet Union effectively defeated in the Cold War, and they said, well, there's now a new Cold War between the United States and China, only China's going to win this one. And by winning, they mean that China would be the dominant power in the world, that it would supplant the United States. And a few years after that, in 1999, two senior People's Liberation Army colonels published a book called Unrestricted Warfare that really laid out how they would go about defeating the United States, short of using military forces because they weren't strong enough to do that. But they had a whole host of techniques, some 20 of them as I recall, running the gamut, as Jay said, from economic warfare and intelligence and subversion and influence operations and the domination of various choke points around the world, something that's now being called the Belt and Road Initiative, on, and military buildups and dominating in space and all kinds of other ambitions. And what we've only really tumbled to recently, and I think partly thanks to the work that our Committee on the Present Danger China has done, is that we're paying for it. We are underwriting the kinds of things that the Chinese are doing in all of these ways to endanger us and to ultimately supplant, if not actually defeat us. And they're doing that through access to our capital markets on a basis which is not comparable to what our own companies have to have if they're going to get access to, our individual investment funds or institutional ones, like the state retirement system of New Hampshire, for example.
Right, you had mentioned that at the lunch that China is actually in charge of a lot of our retirement, including some prominent companies.
They have a number of Chinese companies. We've seen 5 so far. All of
And the U.S. military is one of them, or is going to be one of them?
The United States military is being induced under a plan that's now afoot in Washington, if you can believe it, to have to engage in the same kinds of investments, including in a company called AVIC, which is AVIC, which is an acronym, I think, for the Aviation Industrial Corporation of China or something. Anyway, what it does is it builds ballistic missiles, it builds aircraft, it builds ground weapons. And let's be clear, their purpose is to kill our men and women in uniform, and frankly others of us too. That's the design purpose of these things. It's obscene, honestly, not just insane, obscene, that under a plan afoot now as a result of a decision made some years ago by the Federal Retirement Thrift Investment Board, nobody ever heard of it.
Actually, I have.
Involving, you have?
Yes.
The Thrift Savings Plan.
Because I just got mail today.
There you go.
There you go.
4
It's very
things in the mail
topical.
today.
Well, your sons are all
Yes.
in the United States military. So imagine their retirement funds having to be invested in companies like these in China. And by the way, Chinese companies that, as we were just talking about with Sean, that are brutally repressing their own people as well as threatening ours. This is crazy. And yet, unless we have states like this, unless we have presidential candidates like those who are schlepping around here over the next couple of days, unless we have the American voters and people learning about this problem and insisting that there be corrective action, we're going to continue to underwrite a growing danger to our very existence, and that mustn't be allowed to happen.
And another area that may resonate with a lot more people is drugs. All the
sure.
generic drugs are made in
Well,
China.
this is something that people just generally are not aware of, but along with so much of our supply chain has been moved over time from the United States to China. Low-cost manufacturing was the theory, and much of that has gone to China. One very, I think, terribly important part of that is drugs, so the pharmaceutical drugs. People generally don't know that that's where a vast majority of our drugs are actually manufactured in China, all of our generics, many of the components for our prescription drugs, all of vitamin C, and a number of other very important
Penicillin.
all penicillin. And because of that, we're totally dependent on China. Now, a couple things make that even, just worse than being simply dependent. One is that all the adulteration of drugs, the tampering, the toxicity that we see in dog food, we see it in drywall, it is potentially also in our drugs that can actually, we have examples of where it has actually killed people in blood thinning medications from China. But think about this for a moment. Because we are so dependent on them, if they were to shut off supply today, within 3 weeks, we would be totally shut down as a medical system here in the United States.
So many Americans rely on prescription drugs.
Can you imagine?
That's
Every day.
very personal.
Every day. In fact, we just did a poll, Janine, about these issues, a national poll of likely voters, and 60% of them responded that they were themselves taking prescription drugs. We didn't ask the question, is there anybody in your immediate family who is?
I
it
saw
would
the
be,
charts,
it would be even
and that
larger.
was nonpartisan. So it was people all across the political
Absolutely.
spectrum. We all, they
And-
all voted
and
about the same way.
to your
but
point,
it's a danger.
the demographic distribution was more or less identical to what we saw in the last election, the 2016 election. And whether they were Republicans or Democrats, whether they were black or white, whether they were rich or poor, whether they were any other ethnic or other combination, they all basically responded, specifically on this particular issue, by saying, we don't like the idea that we're dependent on China for drugs. And on issue after issue after issue, when they knew what the score was, in most cases, overwhelming majorities came down on the same side, saying, this is not acceptable. We should not be underwriting the Chinese threat. We should not be acceding to what they're trying to do to dominate the world, or space, or the kinds of weapon systems that they're now pointing at us, some of which, again, are being funded by our own people. These are very common sense responses to a very present danger.
And you both knew President Ronald Reagan. And I just did a show where we were a tribute to Ronald Reagan, and we had cake to celebrate his birthday, which is
Good for
February
you. February 6th.
My wife and I danced about 6 feet away from him and Nancy at his inauguration.
I'm going to go back and look for you the pictures. And President Reagan called the Soviet Union the evil empire. And what he meant by that is it's communist. Communism is evil. And with this push towards socialism in our country, it's very alarming because socialism is one step away from communism. And communism is not a nice...
It
A
was
small step at that.
Yeah,
It's total state control.
right.
Yeah,
And people
don't know
need
if-
to understand
Well,
that.
I don't know if all of your viewers are familiar with what's known as the social credit score. But the social credit score in China is a way of manipulating and controlling virtually everybody in China by giving them a credit score largely based on how loyal they are to the communist regime, and whether they show the proper degree of respect and do all the things that are. And if they're suspect at all, they're punished. And they're punished in sometimes small ways, maybe being denied the ability to travel, an airline ticket, or the ability to go to a particular school, or in terms of a job, or even worse. And and now they're able to do that largely because they have the technology to do so. If you think about where you can learn about a person and their activities electronically now, and with all of the artificial intelligence that they have developed and frankly stolen from the United States, and these
And
companies.
surveillance cameras and data mining and artificial intelligence.
And
all
Facial
getting
recognition.
Back to when Sean was sitting here, Sean Lin, Dr. Sean Lin, the systematic state-sanctioned organ harvesting from non-consenting prisoners of conscience. So that's the key words there, non-consenting prisoners of conscience,
are
if you
the
don't fall in line.
They are the victims of the social credit system. At the end of the day, they are being assigned, a certain priority in terms of extracting their organs because of what the system has been able to develop in terms of biological data and other information. They're imprisoned, they're being punished, and their organs will be taken from them. But just on Jay's point, to tie this back into the New Hampshire retirement system is invested in a company called Hikvision, H-I-K Vision. Hikvision is actually one of the principal means by which this social credit system is being
The
put into
surveillance,
place.
the electronics behind it, Hikvision.
Right.
And what people in New Hampshire don't know, and people generally don't know, is where their money is being invested in Chinese companies that are meant to do harm to not only Americans, but also commit heinous human rights violations within China.
And they're also beginning to export this social credit system elsewhere around the world. One of the other interesting data points on our poll was, do you think that's a good idea? And Americans didn't think that was a good idea. They particularly didn't like the idea of it bringing it here, of course, but even elsewhere in the world, in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America. These are places where there are regimes that would love to have the kind of totalitarian domination of their people. That's not in the interest of Americans who love freedom and who want to encourage it elsewhere around the world.
And your website, presentdangerchina.org, do you have the graphs from that poll?
We do. We have the poll in its entirety. We also have dozens and dozens and dozens of videos with people like Joe and so many others that have helped us explicate what we're up against. They're basically short, they're very viewable, and they teach you about the sorts of things that we're talking about here today in more detail, and really commend it to your audience as a vital resource. They have a need to know, not least because right here in this state in the next few days, they're going to begin giving their votes to candidates for the commander-in-chief job. And without regard to which party or which political philosophy they may have, that commander-in-chief is going to have to deal with China as the #1 priority, certainly in the national security space, arguably in the economic and probably the public health space
Absolutely.
as well.
Janine, one other thing I want to make sure we do mention here is just, even within our country, we're totally asleep at the switch in terms of what Chinese nationals are doing here in our own country in terms of espionage, taking our technology, stealing our secrets, our very, very vital capabilities that are allowing them to be more successful in artificial intelligence, building weapon systems, and so forth. And some of your viewers may not know, because it really didn't make the kind of highlight news that it should, that just last week there were 3 major arrests in Boston, right, just down in Boston, of espionage from China. And one of them, and this is incredible, but a Harvard professor who is the chairman of the chemistry department was arrested and had been receiving hundreds of thousands of dollars from the Chinese government for selling secret information to them. It's
Even
almost
as he was
unbelievable.
working with the U.S. Defense Department.
Fantastic is the
as
word.
well.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then just on a very personal basis, in addition to those 3, Raytheon, there's an employee of Raytheon who actually had access to very sensitive weapons systems information, who took that information back to China. He was also arrested. And the weapons that he was working on, and this is why it's personal to me, is that they're the exact kind of missiles that are meant to give our troops, give our Air Force and Navy the ability to do air combat. And my son, of course, flies the F-18 for the U.S. Navy. And these are missiles that could do harm to him up in the air, and that's what's going on. And now the reason I mention this is not just because of these incidents, but because this is just the tip of the iceberg.
Right.
There are so many more elements of espionage that are going on right underneath our eyes, and we need to be awake to
Just
this.
to give you a sense of this, speaking of academic institutions, there are about 300 to, by some estimates, 400,000 Chinese students in the United States And I'm not going to tell you that all of them are working for the Chinese security services, collecting intelligence or stealing secrets. But if we don't think some of them are, if only because the government there will coerce them into doing so by threatening their families
Well,
who are back home.
And every
This is a real counterintelligence problem.
And every single one of them has to sign an agreement before they leave China that they will disclose any and all information requested by the Chinese government upon their return.
For the motherland.
That's very frightening.
It is.
That's very frightening. And we owe it to ourselves to get educated and to learn more.
We do.
Because I don't think we're being told by the mainstream media.
Well, and
Or
we
our
thank
leaders, for that matter, most of them.
and we thank you for giving us this opportunity to be here to do this today, because this is really the beginning of a major effort. And I credit Frank and Joe and Sean for really devoting themselves to this cause.
And to you too, Jay. Thank
Well,
you for
thank
your
you.
help.
Thank you, Jay, for all you do. And thank
Cheers,
you
too.
for coming on the show today.
Thank
We're
you,
just
Janine.
about out of time. But it was very nice meeting all
Janine,
of you.
thank you.
And Sean, who's sitting in our audience. Thank you. Thank you for coming to Merrimack today.
And thank you for your service.
Oh, you're welcome.
And your boys.
My boys. I love my boys.
Yours
all,
too.
all the kids.
Amen.
So, thank you for watching, and I hope you'll watch this more than once and go to this website, presentdangerchina.org, to learn more. Thank you.